Well, thank you very much, and I want to also thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of this historic program and one of the great churches in our state and indeed in our country. I couldn't help but think as we were hearing about Knox and Calvin about how calm and tame the times are now. Did you notice that? Maybe a little too calm, a little too tame. Maybe we're capable of greater things than we think we are. Certainly when we think of our forefathers and those founders of our faith, they did great things in turbulent times, and they were successful, although it was tough. I want to say several things to you all tonight. First, I want to begin by saying to you that I'm delighted to be here with my good friend, Governor Holshouser. As we came in tonight, someone said, now, governors, we know that you all are in different parties, but we trust you can sit in the same seats here together tonight. To which Governor Holshouser responded truthfully, yes, we are in different parties, but we always got along very well. You see, I was his lieutenant governor. Did you remember that? And as a matter of fact, he said, you know, we got along a lot better than we did with some other people in our party. And I might add, we got along a whole lot better than we did with a lot of folks from the legislature. You know? And he's right when he says we'd rather be with you. The 175th anniversary of founding the church is really a very significant occasion. And I think that it is something that all of you ought to think about as you celebrate it in this church as a member of it, in terms of what your own obligations are. I want to say that one of the things you're doing here that I appreciate is the television service of your Sunday morning services. And I had a special reason to come to appreciate that when my mother was an invalid lying in bed in my home for about 2 years. And I want you folks to know that every Sunday that television was turned to your services. First Presbyterian in Raleigh. And the Hunt family appreciates it. Let me also say to you that even though as I calculated, Governor, since 1968, all the governors of North Carolina, be 24 years before long, have been Presbyterians. Is that correct? Have I missed somebody? But I want to tell any of you all plan to run for governor again, it's not in the Constitution, nor is it in any law that you have to be a Presbyterian to be governor of North Carolina. But it does help. I want to pursue the track that those who have gone before me have followed tonight in terms of a little bit of the history. And I think that's a good thing for you to do this evening. Unlike the Congregationists of Massachusetts and Connecticut, the Baptists of Rhode Island, Episcopalians of Virginia, the Quakers of Pennsylvania, the Dutch Reformers of New York, or the Catholics of Maryland, there was no Presbyterian colony in this new land before and about the time that you all established this church. Yet for 50 years, an influx of Presbyterian Scots from Ulster formed the first big migration of people to America. The coming of the Ulster Scots did more than anything to transform the timid colonists looking to Europe, always thinking back about Europe and looking there for sustenance, transforming them into a self-reliant and independent people, which we see ourselves as today. The first American Presbyterian minister of distinction was Francis McKinney. He organized the widely dispersed Presbyterians within the colonies. You heard earlier that there weren't churches here in the early days. There were just Presbyterians scattered around. But he organized them for the first time, and he brought seminary graduates from Scotland. Dr. McKinney's travels brought him to the New York colony, where Lord Cornbury was governor. Now, despite the fact that there was a Toleration Act, Lord Cornbury forbade dissenting ministers like McKinney to preach without a license. Well, this Presbyterian minister, McKinney, defied the law and preached anyway. And he was imprisoned and tried. But then the thing turned. Reverend McKinney was ultimately acquitted. But then Lord Cornbury was charged with misconduct and was recalled in disgrace. So McKinney's victory was a notable one for free speech, religious liberty, and justice. But it wouldn't have happened if that brave Presbyterian minister hadn't said, "I have the right to preach," and stood up in the pulpit and did it, even though the government told him he could not. A major force behind the American Revolution was a burning desire for religious freedom. In addition to a desire to resist British taxation, was a fear of bishops appointed by the Church of England. In fact, many people asserted that the American Revolution, maybe you haven't heard this before, was a Presbyterian rebellion. The American Revolution. And one reason for this was a similar claim that America had, quote, run off with a Presbyterian pastor. And of course, they were talking about John Witherspoon. See, John Witherspoon was the president of Princeton University, and he was a Presbyterian pastor. And less than 8 years after his arrival as an immigrant from Scotland, he signed as the only clergyman the Declaration of Independence. In addition to him, there were 11 Presbyterian laymen who signed that Declaration of Independence. So the Presbyterian Church and its leaders were just completely tied up with all of the ideas that brought about the Revolution and, of course, the Declaration of Independence itself. Now, the first ecclesiastical organization in America openly to recognize the Declaration of Independence was the Presbytery of Hanover in Virginia. When the War of Independence was moved south, it was the men of the back country in Virginia and the Carolinas, predominantly Scotch-Irish, who provided the backbone of the Army. The amazing military victories of Kings Mountain in North Carolina and Cowpens in South Carolina were won by undisciplined militia troops composed of these kind of men and commanded by Presbyterian elders. Most Scotch-Irish Presbyterians arrived from Ulster in Philadelphia. That was the chief port of demarcation. They arrived during the Great Migration to the early 18th century. And then many of them, I guess most of them, made their way south into the North Carolina backcountry over the Great Philadelphia Wagon Train Road. What is now known as the Piedmont Crescent was settled in large measure by these hardy, thrifty pioneers. Now, these Scotch-Irishmen have been described by some writers as, quote, clannish, contentious, and hard to get along with. The Scotch-Irishman was usually well set in his ways, as illustrated by the prayer that was attributed to him, quote, Lord, grant that I may be right, for thou knowest that I am hard to turn. Church were just as important then as they are now. It was said of those Presbyterians, the Scotch Irishman is one who keeps the commandments of God and every other good thing he can get his hands on. Well, in spite of these qualities, or perhaps because of them, the Scotch Irish made a great contribution to the growth and the expansion and the development of North Carolina. You can go into the hills of the Piedmont and go to those early textile mills where our first industries, really. We first started processing our cotton. Many of them were set up by Presbyterian business leaders of those days. Presbyterians have also long been supporters of higher education. The first successful effort to establish a college in North Carolina was made by Presbyterians of Mecklenburg County, who in 1770, that's before we established the university, you all, who in 1770 persuaded Governor Tryon to recommend to the Assembly that it establish a, quote, public seminary in some part of the back country of this colony for the education of youth. This led to the passage of an act on January the 15th, 1771, incorporating Queens College at Charlotte, North Carolina, as our first college. Individual Presbyterians were prominent in founding and heading the University of North Carolina, as you've already heard here this evening. The first permanent college founded in the state by the Presbyterian Church was in 1837, when Davidson College, Governor Holshouse's alma mater, was open to 65 students. And out of that college came, of course, one President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Davidson was named for General William Lee Davidson, one of the heroes of the Battle of Kings Mountain. And so you see this church, our faith, our denomination, has been a vital part of the history and the development of this country, and certainly of North Carolina. As we were asked to relate to you a little bit about what this heritage what role it's played in our own lives, it really struck me that there are two things about the Presbyterian history and faith and traditions that I think have really affected my life. And the first one really grows out of the Reformed tradition. And the fact that Presbyterians from the very earliest times believed that we didn't any longer have to go through a pope to God or even a bishop, that we could pray directly. And that is very fundamental in terms of both our access and our responsibility. That puts, if you have that kind of freedom, it puts a heavy responsibility on you in terms of what you do. Because then you see God speaks back to you. As you speak directly to God, God speaks back to you. And in many different kinds of ways, not always most clearly perhaps, lets us know what He would have us to do. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see Presbyterians in so many areas of public service, including in public leadership, going into politics, going into government. We feel that responsibility to do what we think God really wants us to do. And we think that God, in a sense, is saying, I'm depending on you to do something. And if we feel that way, then we better get out there and do our best. Then the other thing, in addition to that feeling of responsibility that comes to you, I think that has affected my life so much has been the matter of the emphasis that Presbyterians put on education. This church, more than any other that I know, has been the leader in this country. Many of them, of course, have also worked hard at it. But I think the Presbyterians really stand out in founding schools and founding colleges and universities, in seeing that their ministers are extremely well educated and prepared. And that, of course, is a responsibility that we must continue to meet. And I think it's part of the reason why we see the obligation that we have, because those ministers that come out of our seminaries have been so well prepared. They have been sensitized to the needs of people so much that they do lead us in our congregations in recognizing what our responsibilities as Christian laypersons are. Let me finally say to you that I believe that this church right here, I want to tell you that when the governor looks out his window, and one of these days we'll see out of her window, right below where you all are sitting over here, the thing you see is the First Presbyterian Church of Raleigh. And that's symbolic in a sense. But more than that, the life and the influence of this church has been felt on governors and their families and legislators and other leaders of this state. I would want to encourage you all to keep alive the sense of history that our denomination and your church in particular has. There are things that need to be done today just like they were years ago. We don't have to stand up to British kings or queens that might chop off our head or put us in prison. But there are things we need to do. This church has led in the doing of it. And I urge you that over your next 175 years, you continue to do that. Thank you.
I would be remiss if I did not take a moment before I began to express to Ed and to the session and to the congregation of First Church my deep appreciation for the invitation to participate with you in this great celebration. It is a moment that is not without some emotion for me. I first began to participate in the regular worship of God somewhere about 2/3 of the way back on the right-hand side of this sanctuary. I still remember as a child being fascinated by this network of beams and probably watched that more than I paid any attention to what was going on up here. But it was also the case that I first heard my father regularly preach from this pulpit, though I think it may have been over there in those days. So I am deeply grateful for the chance to be back to the place where I started in the Church of Jesus Christ. Listen now to the New Testament lesson, which is selected portions of the 11th chapter of the Epistle to the Hebrews. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it those of old received divine approval. By faith we understand that the world was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things which do not appear. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was to go. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered faithful the one who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your descendants be named." By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Thus the New Testament lesson. I want to speak this morning about the past and the future, and about the particular human activity that links them together in the present. That is the act of remembering. And I mean specifically the act of remembering, not just memory. All of us have memories as individuals and as institutions. They are stored up in abundant fashion, and they've been being stored up and accumulating in individuals and groups within this congregation over 175 years. But what has been going on for the past week, and will go on for the next weeks and months, has been a large and exciting and probably sometimes emotional act of conscious remembering, of pulling out of the storehouses of our minds and the many recorded remnants of this church's story, the memories that have been there. If I understand what the scriptures say, such conscious remembering is not an accident. It is something we are called to do. Time and again, I hear in the Bible the command, remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. In our Old Testament lesson, the command of God is heard, look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you. The community of faith is called to do just what First Church is doing in this time. To look back in its story to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. And what I wish to do this morning is not to share memories, but to think with you about what it means that the church remembers, that it consciously looks at and recalls what has happened and those who have gone before. And I want to do that by asking two simple questions. What does the church remember, and why does it remember? The answer to that first question is a rather simple one. The church remembers its story. The church remembers its story. One might have said that the church remembers its history, but that is not quite the same thing. That suggests a formal record of dates and events and people, of decisions and actions, of pastors and buildings and the like, and all of that is central to the story. But the story is not only what is recorded in the history books. It is that and more. It is the way we tell about it to our children and to new members. The way we recall it in conversations among ourselves through the years. As such, it is not only the formal record contained in minutes and documents and the written history which you now have, it is also memories of Sunday school teachers, anecdotes that are told about individual members, church picnics and the like. It is a story about emotions of joy and pain, of memories of when our children were baptized and married, of pastoral visits by beds of pain and prayers that supported us when a husband died or a child was suddenly struck down. It is the story of sermons, Sunday after Sunday, or singing again and again, or listening to old hundreds, and how those sermons, and how hearing those words to that music shaped us and affected us. The feel of what it is like to be a part of a congregation over a long period of years, or to be connected to a congregation that has a long history. But if what the church is to remember is its story, there are some things, I think, to guide us, or maybe to keep in mind as we do that. And one of them is that we are to remember our particular story. That's really what this whole week has been about, in the months that lie ahead. Remembrance and celebration of the life and work of one congregation of God's people over a long period of time. The past that affects us most is likely to be the past that is closest to us. It is a story we have lived and been a part of. Some of it through our fathers and mothers, our grandfathers and grandmothers, our friends. Some of it is our own experience. But your own participation as a congregation over nearly 2 centuries in the mission of the church, its service to the world, its nurture of the souls and minds of young children, its care of broken hearts and support of broken bodies, that is the particular story that you as a church remember in these days. But when the church remembers, it is not only our particular story as a congregation, but also the larger story of which we are part that we are to call to mind. The life and work of this congregation is a part of the work and mission of the whole church throughout its long history. When God says through the prophet in the book of Isaiah to the Judean people in exile, look to the rock from which you were hewn, God does not mean simply to recall the immediate past, the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the leaders of the kingdom of Judah. God calls the people to look all the way back to how they came into being, the way their past had been when they were only one family starting out at God's command. We do not remember just the part of the story that has to do with us directly. We remember the story we will tell again and again when we affirm the Apostles' Creed after this sermon. We remember the foundation of the church on the witness of the apostles and the blood of the martyrs. We remember the struggle of the early Christians as a minority group in a hostile world, and of much later Christians as minority groups in a hostile church. We remember the struggle of those early Christians, their insistence that there was no authority on earth that could claim their ultimate allegiance, and that in our own time the church has had to declare that there is no earthly authority and no leader and no state that can claim its ultimate allegiance. We remember not only 300 members of this church went out in the 1940s to colonize the White Memorial Presbyterian Church, but we also remember much earlier when David Livingstone went to Africa and William Carey to India. All of that is part of the story of First Presbyterian Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And First Church is a part of all of that. And it celebrates and learns from the larger past of the church as well as from its 175 years. But whether it is our particular part of the story or the larger story of the whole church, it is important that we remember the whole story. The good and the bad, the high points and the low ones, times of success and times when we were dwindling. One of the dangers of celebration of the past is that we tend to remember selectively. The good is to be remembered and celebrated. The faithfulness of members in the service of Christ, the pastoral care of ministers through the years, creation of new churches, the service to persons in time of need. But we do not forget either when we have failed, when our devotion to Christ has not marked the way, when conflicts and hostilities have betrayed the fellowship and threatened the peace and unity of the church. Mary Ann and I attend the Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton. It started another church in Princeton back in the 19th century, the Witherspoon Presbyterian Church. It was only about 6 blocks away from our church, and the two churches now frequently meet together for services of worship and work together on various projects. But what we always need to remember is that the Witherspoon Presbyterian Church grew out of the Nassau Presbyterian churches wanting its black Presbyterians to meet and worship somewhere else other than with us. That was long before my time, or the time of any of the present members of Nassau Church, but we dare not forget it as we ask about the future and what we are to do now. Faith and faithlessness, glory and shame, failure and success, the life and work of this particular church, the story of the whole church, that is what we remember. That leaves the question, then, why does the church remember? Well, there are a lot of answers that could be given to that, and I think I've already been indicating them implicitly. I'll suggest simply two. The first is that we remember as our story as a church because it helps us understand who we are and how we are supposed to be and act in this world. To recall and remember and retell that story is to know how we got our particular shape as God's people, and in fact, to be reshaped afresh as we remember that story. Sometime in my youth, I have no idea when it was, my father told me and my two sisters a family story. It happened before he was born. His family lived on what we would call a poor dirt farm in the little community of Red Hill, Georgia, which got its name appropriately. And one week, the little white frame Hopewell Presbyterian Church that they attended every Sunday had a week's service of mission emphasis. And the missionary from Africa came and preached every evening. And on the last evening, they had a service of dedication and took up an offering for the work of missions in Africa. Well, my grandfather and grandmother simply did not have any cash, any money. And so my father told me my grandmother that evening dedicated the unborn child in her womb to the missionary service of God in Africa. Now, that's a rather strange thing to do, or I thought it was a rather strange thing to do. But that child was Hoyt Miller, who spent 40 to 50 years as a missionary in the Belgian Congo. Now, I've asked my sisters if they remember hearing that story, and they remember it very vividly. It's only much later that we realize that Daddy did not tell us that story simply as an interesting anecdote, but that we were to remember that story and tell it to the next generation as a way of understanding who we are and what we are like as a family. God told the people in exile to look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you, for he was but one when I called him, but I blessed him and made him many. That is, go back to the stories of your past as God's people, the Lord says, and there you will learn who you are and how I have been with you and cared for you and guided your life through the ages. There you will learn how men and women have answered my call and followed me for the sake of the world, showing the way of righteousness and justice and peace. Hebrews 11 is a marvelous example of the church remembering Abraham and Sarah and others. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place, and he went out not knowing where he was to go. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered faithful the one who had promised. To look to the rock from which you were hewn is to ask afresh, how did we come to be here? What sort of witness did our forefathers and mothers bear in this city and the world in which they lived? What were the tests of their faithfulness? Where did they fail? What sort of leadership did they give? What mattered to them most in being a Presbyterian church? When the church remembers that way, it does not live in the past. The past informs the present and shapes the future. From those who have gone before and their story, not all of which will be happy, we learn something of how we are to be the church today. I remember when we lived in Richmond and were members of the Second Presbyterian Church in Richmond, there was a discussion group that met over several weeks, wrestling with how, as Christians, we should think and act about war. And one of those evenings, a woman in the group said at one point, you would think that we here at Second Church would be very reluctant ever to go to war with our experience as a church and a community in the Civil War. Of course, she had in mind the terrible devastation of Richmond and the fires that had burned the small church that had begun in the 1840s. But we also recalled at that time that there was considerable glorification of war in those years also, and we needed to remember that too. So all this celebration begins in joy and thanksgiving and praise to God as First Church remembers the goodness of God. Look to Abraham your father, for he was but one when I called him, but I blessed him and made him many. And that, my friends, has been your story also. And that is why, too, that the last note of the 175th celebration, when it is sounded, should be one of confidence about the future. Not in ourselves, for we will often blow it, but in the God whose steadfast love endures forever, whose mercy is forever sure, and whose faithfulness endures from age to age. The Lord's words about looking to the rock from which you were hewn, to Abraham your father and Sarah your mother, were addressed to a congregation of weary, despairing exiles who had given up on the future and given up on God. And the reason they were to remember was that the story of the past would make clear to them that the Lord will comfort Zion, will comfort all her waste places, and will make her wilderness like Eden. So it happened to them, and so I really do believe it will be for you. The future is God's, and that is sufficient for us all. The closing lines of the chapter on the church in our Southern Presbyterian contemporary confession of faith, called a Declaration of Faith, seem to me to be the appropriate ones for closing this morning and beginning your year of remembering. They are these words: we confess we are heirs of this whole story. We are charged to remember our past, to be warned and encouraged by it, but not to live it again. Now is the time of our testing as God's story with the church moves forward through us. We are called to live now as God's servants in the service of people everywhere.